After 2 presidential terms of Thomas Jefferson, we are now going to see the election of 1808, which is the 6th presidential election of the United States of America. So when we look at the 2 political parties that are relevant at this time, we're going to see the Democratic Republican Party, who puts up James Madison, who we know is a man of extreme political importance at this time, and his vice president, George Clinton, against Federalist Charles Pinckney, who we know has ran before and kind of, flopped in that election, and his vice president, Rufus King. So ultimately, at the end of this, we know that the Federalist Party is already kind of fizzling out at this point, and Madison from the Democratic Republican Party wins with 122 electoral votes, Pinckney only gathering 47 electoral votes, and Vice President George Clinton, who thought he could become president at this time and ran also, only has 6 electoral votes and ends up becoming vice president again to the 4th president of the United States, James Madison. When James Madison becomes president, he has a few things that he needs to address and fix, and one of them is the Embargo Act of 1807 and what it did to the American economy. So just to refresh, during Thomas Jefferson's 2nd presidential term, he passed the Embargo Act of 1807 to pretty much teach Britain and France a lesson. So there was a lot of conflicts going on between the 3 of those, and Thomas Jefferson thought by cutting off trade, cutting off exports to these nations and not allowing trade to happen at all with the United States and the rest of the world, this would teach France and Britain a lesson because they would suffer economically. But ultimately, the United States ended up suffering economically because the bottom line is our new nation needed trade to survive. So James Madison, when he becomes president, passes the Non-Intercourse Act in 1809, and this allowed trade with everyone except for France and England. So this sounds great on paper because if you think about it, now we're back to trading, things are coming in and out of the country. However, France and England are our 2 biggest trading partners, so we're still suffering economically at this point. So this was ultimately really hard to enforce, and it still messed up the economy a lot. So given that, it was repealed in 1810 and ultimately replaced with Macon's Bill, which led to an issue that was continuously getting worse with Britain and the United States. And the reason for this is the Macon's Bill number 2 begins trade with France, and Britain is still shut out of trade. They're still impressing ships. They're still not allowed to trade with the United States. So the United States is mad that Britain is still impressing their ships and that they won't make peace with the United States, and Britain is ultimately furious that they're still cut off from trade with the United States. So this is going to fuel the fire and ultimately lead to this conflict that will snowball into the War of 1812. During these years before the War of 1812, we see a lot of issues between Britain and the United States going on the world stage, but there's also issues that are going on inside the United States that Britain is kind of roped into that are really important as well. So one of these events is the Battle of Tippecanoe. So the key figures that are involved in this are Tecumseh, who is the Shawnee leader, the Prophet, which is his brother, William Henry Harrison, who's the governor of Indiana and ultimately becomes one of our presidents one day, and all of the Native Americans that gather in support of Tecumseh and the 1,000 troops that gather in support of William Henry Harrison during this battle. Now that we went over the important figures, let's go over what it was and why it was important. So Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, basically have this idea to join all the neighboring Native American tribes and get together in this confederacy in Prophetstown, which is a place right on the river of Tippecanoe, which is where the Battle of Tippecanoe gets its name. And they get together and they decide that they are going to join against the United States expansion in Native territory. So as we talked about previously, the Battle of Fallen Timbers led to the Treaty of Grenville, which gave a lot of Native American territory to the American settlers. But Tecumseh, the Prophet, and a lot of the Native American followers are gaining a lot of support in the idea that they want to fight this expansion. They want their lands back, and they want to fight for their cause. So due to this idea, you're going to see the United States becoming very uncomfortable and uneasy. So William Henry Harrison, as the governor of Indiana, tries to come to this agreement with Tecumseh to basically get what he wants, to make sure that they can keep expanding, that there wasn't going to be this continuous conflict. But this was not met with any success. So ultimately, Harrison marches with an army of 1,000 to stop the Confederacy and break apart this idea of this conflict and gaining back land. So he marches to Prophetstown, right along Prophetstown on the river of Tippecanoe, and ultimately he is surprise attacked by the Prophet and his supporters, the Confederacy, and ultimately, although he is shocked and really thrown off, William Henry Harrison defeats them and burns down Prophetstown. Besides the fact that this is a huge pivotal moment for the Native Americans and also for the American settlers who wanted to keep expanding, this was also important because it made the United States furious and Britain. And I know this sounds kind of off base because it seems like this is between the American settlers and the Native Americans, but during the entirety of this conflict, and even before this conflict, the British in British Canada were really giving their support to the Native Americans because they didn't want American settlers to continue to expand. So although this seems like an internal affair, the British really had their hands all over this situation, and they were pulling a lot of the levers and controlling what was going on here. So because of this, obviously the United States was becoming more furious with Britain, and this was fueling the fire even more for the War of 1812. And as we're going to see down the line, Tecumseh, after this event, ultimately feels defeated and he flees to Britain, but then he regathers himself, he gains the support back, and then ultimately allies with the British in the War of 1812. So as we can see, although this seems like it's just between the Native Americans and the American settlers exclusively, Britain is involved in this conflict, and it's going to erupt even more as the war begins to unfold. So we've talked about some heavy content here, like, issues between the Native Americans and the American settlers, and the economy kind of being ruined by the Intercourse Act and things like that. And it seems kind of off base to go into a steamboat at this point, but it's important to realize that this innovation and this invention of the steamboat that was brought into the United States was a huge deal and kind of a game changer for the new United States. So we're going to talk about the New Orleans. The New Orleans was the first steamboat to travel down the Mississippi River on January 12, 1812. And this idea and this model was built by Nicholas J. Roosevelt and Robert Fulton. Ultimately, the nuts and bolts of the steamboat was that it cost $40,000 to make, and it traveled at a whopping 10 miles per hour, which seems like not a lot when we think about the speeds that we see boats going now. But back then, this was huge, and this was a ginormous deal, and it was a game changer, like I said earlier. And although this boat sank during its first expedition, it completely changed the way that New Orleans was as a city, and it changed the entirety of the United States. You're going to see that this innovation would bring in a lot of money and a lot of new ideas and ways to use the steamboat, and it would also be this focal point for the Industrial Revolution that would completely modernize and change the economy of the United States and a lot of other European nations. The Warhawks were a political group who pulled a lot of weight leading up to the War of 1812 and ultimately, led the way for this war becoming a thing. So you're going to see that the Warhawks are a group of anti-British Republicans who wanted war with Britain. And this group was made up of mostly people from the southern United States and the western United States. And it's important to stress that this group was not just a group of radical people who wanted to go to war with Britain at this time. This group was made up of a lot of important political figures who pulled a lot of weight in this early United States. You're going to see important political figures like Henry Clay on the left and John C. Calhoun on the right. And just to stress the importance of these people, you can see John C. Calhoun on the right ended up being a vice president of the United States. So this really stresses the importance and the weight they pull in government and in politics. So this group had three main plans that they intended to, put at the center of what was important to them. You're going to see that number one, obviously, they wanted to declare war on Britain. After all of the conflict that was going on between the United States and Britain, they thought it's been way overdue at this point. Also, they wanted to take Florida from Spain. And lastly, they wanted to invade British Canada. And the reason for these three goals and objectives really surrounded the fact that one, basically, they were tired of Britain walking all over the United States. And two, they really wanted to expand, and Britain was getting in the way of that. And also, they wanted that land from Spain. So this group, like I said earlier, they constantly pressured presidents to go to war. And these two presidents that they really focused on were Thomas Jefferson, because as we talked about, he had issues throughout his presidency with Britain, and James Madison, because it took James Madison a little bit to finally, pull that trigger and go to war. So these efforts ended up finally being successful when James Madison declared war in 1812 and started the War of 1812, but the war hawks really had these three ideas in mind, and they pushed and pushed and pushed until finally James Madison declared war. In June 1812, James Madison finally asks for a declaration of war that would begin the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain. And although this conflict seems like it has been going on forever between the United States and Britain, and it seems like everyone should really be on board with the fact that they need to go to war with Britain at this point, that isn't the case. So when James Madison finally gets this approval to go to war, this country is not on the same page. You're seeing the Federalists, who are placed in the North, saying that the economy needs to be based on trade, and they need to have a decent relationship with Britain, who is their most important trading partner and helps out their economy significantly. So they feel that this war is a disaster and should not happen at all. And then you see the Southerners and the Westerners, who are mostly the Democratic Republicans. Keep in mind that James Madison is a Democratic Republican. You're going to see that they feel like expansion is the way to go if they want to increase the country's money and help their economy and keep progressing as a nation. So you're going to see that they feel like in order to keep expanding and in order to really show what the United States is about, they need to stand up to Britain, and they need to show that Britain cannot keep getting involved in their affairs with the Native Americans, and they can't keep impressing their soldiers because they're wrecking the economy and they're ruining westward expansion. So you're going to see that although the country is divided at this point, the Federalist Party is weakening. So in the end, the declaration of war is approved, and now the United States is officially going to war with Britain. So although this war is now beginning and you have a lot of people who want this war, this is not the best time for a war. So the Federalists might have some good points here when they say that the war is not a good idea at this time, because the United States does not have as much money, does not have as much resources, and does not have as much military power as they should. And they really don't have the military strength that Britain has at this point. So Britain's been a nation for a long time. The United States is relatively new. So Britain's Navy really overpowers the US Navy in terms of numbers and things like that. So that's really going to be something important as we move forward here. So I know that one of the previous slides we talked about the Battle of Tippecanoe, which really angered the Americans because they felt that Britain involved themselves in the issues with the Native Americans and such, and they created this alliance with Native Americans that would essentially weaken their ability to expand westward. So in order to get revenge for a lot of the things that Britain was doing to them, they decided to go straight into this war and immediately strike Canada, which is where there was a British colony at that point. So even though the United States was relatively unprepared at that point, they were overly optimistic that this entry into Canada and this invasion into Canada was going to be successful. So on August 16th, 1812, they unfortunately faced a humiliating defeat after Sir Isaac Brock and Tecumseh's forces aligned together and chased troops led by Michigan William Hull back across the Canadian border to Detroit, and they had a humiliating surrender where American forces surrendered 2,000 of their troops to the Allied Native American and British troops in Detroit. So this was not off to a good start. As you can see, America thought that this was going to be an easy victory. Thomas Jefferson said himself he thought this was going to be an easy victory, and it's already off to this negative start. But even though we look at this as being a bad jumping off point for this war, there was some significant successes in the first 2 years of the war. So in the West, you're going to see Oliver Hazard Perry successfully held down Lake Erie in the Battle of Lake Erie, and this was great considering how powerful the British Navy was in contrast to the US Navy, because now the Northwest Territory was under US control, and this was huge during this war. Also, you're going to see that William Henry Harrison was able to retake Detroit, which was surrendered by the United States troops in the beginning of the war, and he is able to do this with a victory in the Battle of Thames. And at this point, he's also able to kill Tecumseh, which drastically impacts the British and Native American alliance, and this would alter the course of the fighting a lot between these two powerful nations. And lastly, you're going to see that the U.S. Navy is really getting some victories over the British Navy. So although obviously there is this humiliating loss in Canada, you're going to see that the United States is actually shocking the world a little bit, because whereas we think Britain is this global superpower, they're also in a war with France, and not all of their effort and their attention is focused on the War of 1812. So you're going to see that the United States in the first 2 years of this war is actually getting some victories in against Britain. Prior to 1814, it was an advantage of the United States that Britain was so wrapped up in their war with Napoleon and France. But due to the fact that in April 1814, British defeats Napoleon's armies, the United States is really going to be at a disadvantage and in a really scary spot, because now Britain is going to amp up their efforts and they're really going to pour into North America and focus in on this war with the United States. So after this defeat of Napoleon's armies, you're going to see troops pouring into North America, forces raiding the Chesapeake Bay. They're going to move into the U.S. Capitol eventually, where James Madison and Dolly Madison eventually have to flee to Virginia. This is humiliating, because not only are you're seeing the president having to flee out of the White House, but you're seeing the White House being burned, the Capitol building being burned, you're seeing government buildings being basically annihilated, and this is making a fool out of the United States government in the eyes of the world. And this is exactly what the British wanted to do at this point. And on top of this, you're seeing them attack New England. You're seeing them attack New York, New Orleans, which would eventually cut off access to the Mississippi River, which we know is crucial to the United States for trade, for the economy, for really transporting things needed for this war, basically. So by cutting off all these things, they're making the situation between the Federalists, who didn't want the war, and the Democratic Republicans worse, because New England, New York, this is all based in the north where the Federalists are, and you're also seeing them cut off the most important waterway in the United States, which is going to make things extremely difficult for the United States to bounce back from. And where all of that is completely terrifying and a direct result of the fact that Britain is now all in on this war, there also was some inspiring stuff that came out of 1814, like the Battle of Fort McHenry, where the American Navy shockingly defeated the British fleet, and the scene of a flag hanging over the fort would inspire Francis Scott Key to write a poem, which would eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner, which is really like the song of the United States now. So the national anthem really came out of this year, and also all of this terrifying military action that really shook our country to the core came out of this and showed us what we really were about as a nation. So 1814 truly was a pivotal year in the War of 1812. The Treaty of Ghent was the peace treaty between the United States and Britain that ended this war. So this was signed on December 24th, 1814 in Belgium, and this was agreed upon by the representatives of the United States and the representatives of Britain, and this formally went into effect finally in February 1815. So like I said before, this ended the War of 1812, which was one of the most significant parts of it, and it also led to a lot of agreements between the two nations that would keep the peace for over 200 years. The first being that they wanted to work on ending the slave trade eventually, that England would leave the Northwest Territory, which has been an issue that has been ongoing between the two nations for a long time, the involvement of Britain in the United States affairs, and that Britain would accept the United States as a nation, and this would lead to America becoming a world power, because the world was seeing that America could hold their own against such a powerful nation, such a powerful military like Britain. Also, the pre-war conditions would be restored, meaning that all of the land and the territory and the people that were captured as a result of the War of 1812, they would be returned to each side, and things would go, I don't want to say back to normal, but the land would go back to who it belonged to prior to the beginning of the war. And this was seen as a diplomatic victory for the United States because they were able to keep expanding as a result of this land being returned to them and the British pulling out of the Northwest Territories. So expansion was a big reason why the United States wanted to start this war with Britain, because they felt like Britain was halting their chances of expanding and growing and progressing. So now they were able to expand. They had their land back. They were working on ending slavery and the slave trade eventually. And they had Britain really out of their progress and out of their efforts to grow as a new nation. The Battle of New Orleans was an interesting battle because it was fought after the War of 1812 was over. So as I talked about in the last slide, the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814 in December, but the news was slow to reach both sides and the war kept on going. So on January 8th, 1815, the British and American troops fought in a huge battle where the United States would win. And this would have been a very decisive victory if the war was still going on, because the United States pulled an insane victory out over Britain. So Andrew Jackson, who would become our 5th president, led his diverse group of troops against a really powerful force of British soldiers and earned his stardom as he inflicted serious damage on the British. So this was a battle that the Americans were not supposed to win. This was a very difficult win, but Andrew Jackson pulled out the win. His soldiers pulled out the win, and this was a huge victory. But the weird part was the war was over. So it's definitely an important thing to think about when you're understanding the Battle of New Orleans. In December 1814, 26 delegates from the Federalist Party get together in Hartford, Connecticut, and they secretly talk about their grievances, the reasons why they're upset, and these reasons are all centered around the War of 1812. So as we talked about before, the Federalist Party, which was primarily in the northern states, was very unhappy with the War of 1812. They relied on trade, and specifically trade with Britain, who was the most valuable trading partner at this time besides France. So they felt like this was disastrous to go into war with Britain. And it was for a lot of these Northern Federalists. And it ruined the economy for a lot of them because their economy was based around this relationship with Britain and this relationship with trade, which was essentially cut off during the War of 1812. So when they got together, they talked about how they were going to respond to their grievances and how they felt about basically being ignored when it came to going into war with Britain. And they came up with 2 different solutions. So the one more radical solution that wasn't suggested by all of the delegates but was brought up in conversation during this convention was secession. And this was such a big deal because to secede from the United States would mean, as a state, to take yourself entirely out of the United States of America. So they essentially had this idea floating around that they were just going to leave the country altogether because they felt like they weren't being represented correctly, and they felt like the United States, wasn't really on their side the way they should as a country and a government. And although this didn't pan out, and ultimately this wasn't agreed upon, this was still a very radical thing to even announce at this convention. And secondly, and this was a more common idea in the convention, there were constitutional changes that were suggested and really sent to Washington for James Madison to analyze. And just a few of these are wanting to limit presidential terms from a specific state. So basically, if a president lived in a specific state, he shouldn't be able to run again. And this was really aimed at southern states that held a lot of Democratic Republican candidates, because Federalists typically were placed in the northern states, and it seems like southern states such as Virginia were really holding most of the presidents. So this was a suggestion that they had. They also suggested a 60-day limit to any future trade embargo, which would increase the economy of the North because they really focused heavily on trade to keep their economy going. So when they got together all of these ideas, and these are just to list a few, when they got together all of these ideas, they ultimately sent them in early 1815 to Washington, D.C. for James Madison to look at and for him to analyze and hopefully change things around or change the course of the war. But at this point, this was a horrible decision and horrible timing for the Federalist Party and for the delegates in this convention, because at this time, and no one really realized it yet, the treaty was already signed, the war was already over. And at this point, they just made themselves look bad by sending this, because they looked like they were going against the United States. They looked like they were treasonous. They looked like they were committing treason against the United States by wanting to leave the United States during a war, and this made the Federalist Party begin to fizzle out even more than they already were.